I'm Greg Hunter. Welcome to USAWatchdog.com. With us, a return visit by a guy from the New American magazine, the website, thenewamerican.com. He is Alex Newman. Alex, you're an expert on well, you write about a lot of different things like education, about the deep state, New World Order, Council on Foreign Relations, about the secret hand of government going around the world. You write about that, and I'm sure many more things. But I want to talk about the deep state. I want to talk about what's going on. With all these releases from the IG report that they're just going to be rolling these things out. I mean, we found out from Strzok and Page that the White House is running this operation. That came from the IG report. Tons of information. They're worried over in Europe. Italy is elected a populist government, basically you could call it a pro-Trump, a Trump-type style government. The blue wave is fizzled into down the drain. The blue wave just sucked down the drain. The deep state, are they worried? Are they on the run? Do you think they are worried?
I get the impression that they are very worried. In fact, I think there's a lot of evidence that they're getting concerned, that they're losing their grip on power. And I think we're starting to see some panic now. It very much reminds me of the old, rats fleeing the sinking ship expression. And I suspect we're going to see some very interesting things in the days ahead. I think Trump has kind of gotten them cornered. I think they're actually very, very nervous about what comes next. There's even hints out there that Jeff Sessions may be up to something useful. We'll have to see whether those pan out. But I think there's a lot of good things happening. I think a lot of people, bad guys, are starting to get nervous.
Sessions, I think ABC News reported that he was hiring the most assistant attorneys ever, 300 or so attorneys. So it seems to me they have to clean up the FBI, hire some attorneys, clean up the DOJ if they're going to really put up an effort to jail and prosecute and jail bad guys. Is that right?
Absolutely. And, Trump also just recently signed these executive orders to make it easier to clean up the federal bureaucracies. We have these antiquated civil service protections in place that basically guarantee these deep state bureaucrats and intelligence operatives and all the rest of it, plush job for life, doing whatever they feel like doing. And that's a big problem that Trump has run into in trying to drain the swamp. He can't fire them. He tries to reassign them, and they scream bloody murder. This quote unquote climate policy advisor from the Department of the Interior, Joel Clements, senior executive service member, right? The elite caste of federal bureaucrats who like to think they run the show. They lost it, right? He went to the Washington Post crying and, let me write a column about how evil Trump is. This is retaliation. So now we have these executive orders in place to kind of facilitate a thorough cleansing of the executive branch of the bureaucracies. And so I think that's a good start. We obviously need a lot more, but I think there's some quaking in the boots here of people who have been entrenched for a long time, people who are in strategic positions, thinking that they were going to sabotage Trump's agenda. And so good things are happening, no question about it.
I want to talk about the, in the Bible. I want to say it's somewhere in the Bible. It talks about how that people turn on each other. I don't know if it's in Corinthians or one of the other places in the Bible. I can't remember where it is. But the bad guys actually turn on each other and kill each other. They're going to attack. They're going to make a big attack on Israel, and they ended up killing each other off. Are the bad guys turning on each other? I mean, on one side I see Brennan running his yapper like crazy, and on the other side I see Clapper clapped quiet. Are these guys worried? Are they going to turn on each other and kill each other?
I think that's a possibility. These people have no honor. The old cliche, there's no honor among thieves. Well, it's even more true of, deep state globalist thieves. They have no honor. And we've seen this historically over and over again, right? I think Trotsky is a brilliant example. This guy was a total co-conspirator with the international communist conspiracy. He was fully on board with mass executions, revolution, all the rest of it. Then when he had a falling out with the guys who ended up in charge, he went to Mexico and he ended up with an axe pick in his head. So I think we're going to start seeing that more and more as these deep state swamp creatures start seeing the writing on the wall, recognizing that serious consequences are going to be have to be paid here. And I think we're already starting to see some of that initially. It's hard to know exactly what's going on. I know there's a lot of sealed indictments out there. I know a lot of the Justice Department has been talking to a lot of people. And it's very easy to see how these people could start turning on each other. Hey, you don't want to do life in prison, right? I mean, there's somebody higher than you who is more responsible. All you have to do is, rat them out and everything will be fine for you. So I think there is the prospect of that happening. I think we've seen that happen many times historically, and I think we need to hope for that. We need to pray for that, and we need to work for that.
I can't imagine Huma Abedin going to jail for 50 years to let Hillary Clinton and Bill Clinton and Barack Obama and Clapper and Brennan and Comey and all these people, live the high life where all the underlings like Strzok and Page and McCabe and all these other people go to jail. I find it hard to believe that they're going to just keep quiet and jump on the hand grenade so so all the rest of them can live the high life in their after government life and get off scot free.
Yeah, that's a very good point. There's a lot of underlings who know a lot of things, and why should they go to prison for the rest of their lives when they were just accessories to the crime? They weren't the mastermind. So there is that whole issue with the Clintons. There's a very long and highly suspicious trail of bodies everywhere they go, and so there's certainly that fear. Talking to Roger Stone, a guy who's advised Trump for many decades. He was talking about Seth Rich, the former DNC staffer who ended up shot in Washington, D.C., and he's convinced that this was a murder, not some kind of robbery. And I think there's a lot of that at play. I think a lot of people recognize that, if you turn too early or if you turn and it becomes obvious before, the whole house of cards falls down, you could end up in some serious hot water yourself. But at some point, again, there's no honor among these people. These people would stab their own mother in the back if they thought it would advance their agenda, their ambitions, protect them from trouble. So, I think it's going to be a very interesting spectacle. I would say grab the popcorn and let's work hard to make sure that the truth comes out, that justice is served, and it needs to happen. And if it doesn't happen, we can expect more of the same. And the thing is, Trump knows all this stuff, right? Even during the campaign trail, Trump made absolutely clear that he knew these things. Take ISIS, for example. On the campaign trail, Trump talked about how Hillary Clinton and Obama were the co-founders of ISIS. And the media said, oh, my goodness, he's crazy. What kind of moron would say something like that? He must be delusional. Trump let them hang themselves for a few days, and then he tweeted out the evidence. We have smoking gun documents from 2012 from the Defense Intelligence Agency proving that the U.S. government, one, knew that the Syrian insurgency was being led by al-Qaeda. It's right in the document, black and white, no wiggle room. Two, that they wanted a Salafist principality in eastern Syria. And three, that Western governments, including the Obama administration, the British government, the French government, were involved in all this. So Trump knows this stuff, and he said it publicly, and he finally tweeted out the evidence, and then suddenly everybody was quiet about it. So there is a great deal of understanding about the crimes that a lot of these people have committed. And, helping al-Qaeda, that's not a small crime. Technically, we're supposed to be at war with al-Qaeda. What do you call aiding and abetting somebody that's at war with your country? Oh, yeah, that's treason, right? So there's some very, very serious crimes being committed here. Trump knows all about them. Let's hope that he can start bringing some justice about.
The Iran deal, the nuclear deal, nobody signed it, and I got back. I mean, it says it in the State Department letter from what was the name, Lisa Freifeld, a deputy undersecretary or a deputy secretary for legislative liaison, and she sends it to Pompeo, who's now the head of the State Department. And Secretary of State, and nobody signed it. It had to be fraud. I mean, I just wonder if this is why all the intelligence agencies abroad, at least some of them anyway, teamed up on Donald Trump, because they were going to get caught in a giant fraud. This is a deal nobody signed.
I think that's a big part of what we saw amid the election, is that there was so much fraud going on. There was so much criminality. There was a spy in the Trump campaign. They were listening to these guys' phone calls. Top Trump people were having their phone calls listened to because they were assuming that Hillary Clinton was going to win and none of this was ever going to come out. Now, the tables have turned. Now this information is coming out. We can expect this Inspector General report pretty soon. I know I saw Trump, I think he tweeted out this morning, hopefully they're not changing everything in there and watering it down. But it looks like a lot of this stuff is going to be coming out. A lot of the stuff already has started coming out. Spygate, Trump quite properly said this is bigger than Watergate. It absolutely is. This is huge. So all these different scandals, all these different crimes that they thought that they were going to get away with. Fast and Furious is another one. All these different criminal activities they were involved in. They thought, well, Hillary will come in. Nothing's ever going to happen. Now it's all starting to come out. And if I had been involved in these things, I know I would be very worried.
Well, they tried to plant. It was a counterintelligence operation. They tried to plant the evidence to frame him, as Joe DeGeneres says, trying to frame Donald Trump and the people in his campaign. But let's move on to what do you think the deep state may do? I mean, I saw just this last week or so that George Soros is talking about, there could be another a financial calamity. Could the deep state pull the plug on the world financial system? Could that be one of the things they use to strike back and say, "Oh, hey, this is all your fault, Donald Trump"?
Absolutely. I've been sounding the alarm about this for over a year, quoting people much smarter than me regarding this exact issue. Trump understands the Federal Reserve very well. Actually, even on the campaign trail, he was talking about how they artificially manipulate interest rates, how they cause boom and busts, how they centrally plan all these different sectors of the economy, how they're propping up this phony recovery by maintaining artificially low interest rates. So Trump understands it. He also talked about how great it would be to go back to a gold standard. So Trump has a decent understanding of this, and I think it's a very real possibility that the swamp creatures, that the deep state, if they feel like their entire agenda is threatened, they could very easily pull the plug on the global economy. And that could take a number of different forms. It might use trigger A or trigger B or trigger C, maybe jack interest rates up like crazy, and then try to blame it all on Trump. Try to blame it on either his trade policies or his rhetoric or his refusal to join these multilateral governance schemes like the TPP and the TTIP. So I think that's a very real danger that we could have the establishment that controls the central banking systems of the world, that manipulates stock markets. We know from a report a few years ago that central banks and governments are now the biggest players in the stock market. If they decided to pull the plug on that, stocks collapse. It could cause a calamity. Housing bubble explodes. People lose their jobs. And this has been baked into the cake for a while, but it would be very easy if people still believed the media to collapse it all and blame Trump. We just have to hope that, the American people now have recognized the media is lying to them and would have some understanding that we're being played for fools here.
It looks like, though, Europe is in big trouble, though. They just elected this populist government as I came out. They want to do away with the euro, basically. They want to bring back the lira or something of their own currency. They want to get away from the euro. That could take all the bonds down. That could screw a lot of rich people. I mean, they're all holding all these bonds.
Yeah. Europe is an interesting case, and actually, I wrote about the Italian election right when it happened. And it was a phenomenal blow to the ruling elites, right? The Italian people basically said, no, we don't want establishment party of the right. We don't want establishment party of the left. We want the people who are going to stop the mass influx of quote unquote refugees and migrants. We want people who are going to stand up to the European Union and not allow them to bully us. We want our sovereignty returned to us. And this kind of sentiment is all across Europe. As somebody who spends much of the year living in Europe, this is everywhere. The media does a decent job of trying to hide it, but that's the reality. If you talk to the average Joe Schmo on the street, they do not like the European Union. They're incredibly upset about what the elites have done to their economies, to their currencies, to their populations, right? Angela Merkel inviting in millions and millions of third world immigrants from Africa, from the Middle East, primarily Muslim immigrants. People are upset about this. And if you look at the polls, most Europeans, in fact, the overwhelming majority of Europeans agree with Donald Trump. Right, the European media paints him as some kind of racist, as some kind of lunatic, as some kind of kook. But if you look at the poll, and this was a poll done by the Chatham House, in every country where they did a survey, the overwhelming majority of the people agree with Donald Trump. Put an end to the mass Islamic immigration. In fact, they don't want any more Islamic immigration. Stop stealing our sovereign powers to govern ourselves. And at some point, I don't see how this house of cards survives. You see Soros coming up with all these new ideas about how are we going to do this. Let's have a new Brexit vote, right? We can't let the British leave. Let's make them vote again. And they do this all the time. Make them vote until you get the vote that the establishment wants. And then, okay, now we'll accept it. So they're in quite a pickle. And this is a fascinating time to be alive.
Do you think they could strike back other places other than Europe? Could they have a false flag? Could they have a suitcase nuke go off in heaven forbid downtown New York? I mean, they are desperate. They don't care if they kill, right? I mean, they are. This is a real enemy.
That's exactly right. They have no moral scruples about killing people. In fact, if you look at the machinations of the deep state, which I identify in our special report as a multifaceted thing, but the Council on Foreign Relations, the Bilderbergers, the Trilateral Commission, the Bohemian Grove, the Skull and Bones people. If you look at the fruit of the actions of these people, take Cuba, take China, millions of people have died as a result of their machinations. They have no moral scruples about killing people, and they have no moral scruples about false flags. We have smoking gun documents proving that these people have planned false flags. There's one that strikes close to home, Operation Mongoose, Operation Northwoods. Mongoose was the CIA project. Northwoods was the military project. They were planning to blow up bombs in my home city of Miami, Florida, and blame it on a foreign government. They were going to bomb an airliner filled with civilians and blame it on a foreign government to start a war. So it is absolutely realistic that these people could use some sort of false flag attack to achieve some sort of goal, whether that be, start a war, keep everybody distracted, start a war to further empower international institutions. And if you look, they have been pretty open about admitting how war serves their purposes. In 1968, Lincoln Bloomfield put out a report for the State Department and the Institute of Defense Analyses, a world effectively controlled by the United Nations. And in this report, he said that the quickest way to move from a world of national governments or self-government where individual nations govern themselves to a world, as the report says, effectively controlled by the United Nations, the quickest route to that is to use war or the threat of war. So I think it's absolutely realistic that we could see some sort of real or imagined catalyst that would lead us into another war, whether that's in the Middle East, whether that has to do with Russia, Iran, maybe even North Korea, which is, of course, a puppet of the Communist Chinese government, which is, of course, totally in bed with the globalists. So, we have a lot of dangers to face. And, I recognize Donald Trump has got a tremendous amount of pressure and a tremendous amount of responsibility on his shoulders right now.
Do you think that that these guys are, if you're going to estimate right now, are they losing it? I mean, they were trying to paint this picture of the midterms, this big blue wave, and it's big blue fraud, election fraud and voter fraud. I think that happened in Alabama. I think Roy Moore got absolutely robbed. I think some other fraud happened too, but and there's evidence of it with Project Veritas and Bob Kramer, the guy that they had on camera going to the White House dozens and dozens of times. He had an audience with Obama. There's real election fraud, the real voter fraud. How do you think it's going to shake out in the midterm elections? Are they going to be able to stop the voter fraud?
Well, I think the voter fraud is absolutely ubiquitous. In fact, I think Donald Trump was right when he said millions of people, illegal votes were cast for Hillary Clinton. I think there was massive voting fraud. I think the establishment thought it would be enough to stop Donald Trump, and I think they miscalculated. I think the massive turnout for Trump was so overwhelming that even their voter fraud was not enough to prevent it. And I think it's very possible that we'll see that again. Donald Trump actually tried to get a handle on some of this stuff. He put together a commission with some really great people on it to try to tackle voter fraud. And what happened? The state governments, primarily the leftist state governments, right? California, Illinois, New York, said, we're not going to cooperate with that. What do you mean? You're trying to suppress votes because you don't want illegal immigrants and non-citizens voting. So I think that's a very real danger that we're facing. And if there is any kind of blue wave, I suspect it'll be from that. But even the fake polls that told us that Hillary Clinton was going to win in a landslide are now telling us that this so-called blue wave is much more hype than reality. And that's the fake polls, right? That's the polls that way oversample Democrats, way undersample Republicans, way underestimate the true mood of the American people. So I think vote fraud is a crucial tool in their arsenal. But with good people in Washington, D.C., and there are some at this point, I'm hoping that maybe we can keep that under control, and that if there is some of it, that it will be nipped in the bud, and that people will be held responsible and put in jail where they belong.
Do you think Trump wants to get rid of their money system, the debt? We've been told debt is money and debt is an asset, and we're going to find out neither is true. Do you think that Trump could just turn the table over before the midterms and just attack their debt system and cause massive loss of wealth for all the global elites holding all these bonds?
That is a very interesting question. I know for a fact Trump knows these things, right? Even on the campaign trail.
How do you know that?
Because, on the campaign trail, he talked about some of these things. In fact, I wrote a few articles about it. He came out publicly and he accused the Federal Reserve of manipulating the economy. He said, hey, this is a very false economy. He called it a very fake economy. And he said the Federal Reserve is artificially keeping interest rates low. They're causing all these bubbles. So he understands how this works. In fact, I spoke with someone who was very close to the campaign, was actually serving as a surrogate on the campaign, a friend of mine. And they said Trump understands absolutely how the Federal Reserve System works and the danger that we're in. Whether he will be able to tackle this, I think, is another question. But the fact that he understands it and that he knows about it, I think, is absolutely clear. He has openly said this in public. I think that would be a crucial tool to stop these people, to come out and say, look, this is what we're going to do. This is how it's going to happen. This is what the deep state, the swamp, might try to do, and just make it clear that, any negative consequences that come as a result of this are attributable to the deep state, to the swamp. But whether he will, I don't know. He's got a lot on his plate. He's fighting so many battles at the same time, and we'll have to see what happens.
He's going to do it in 2021 if he gets elected again. I mean, he's going to do it then, for sure. He may have to do it ahead of time. Do you think we might end up? Do any of your sources say we might end up with a new currency? Like you were talking about, Trump would like to use a gold. But he says, well, the price is too low, $1,300 an ounce. Well, you could use gold if it was 10, 12, 15,000 an ounce. I mean, you could use gold and then back it with 20% or 25% or 40%. Do you think we could end up with a new currency?
Well, I think there's two competing forces here. Now, Trump and Pence have both praised the gold standard. They have both, in public, this is no secret information, they've both come out publicly and said the gold standard would be awesome. Now, Trump acknowledged it would be difficult for us to go back to it, but he said it would be great because then we'd have a real economy with money that's based on something real. And Vice President Mike Pence has said similar things. Then on the other hand, you have the globalists. And I wrote about this back in 2008. I did a cover story on the effort to move us toward a global currency. There is absolutely such an agenda, and I know you know this, Greg, because I've heard you talk some about it. But the IMF and their little special drawing rights, there has been a plan in the work for decades to eventually empower the IMF more and more to transform this SDR from a proto-global currency into a real global currency, into a full-blown global currency that would replace the dollar as the global reserve currency. And during the Obama administration, they were actually openly saying this stuff. The communist Chinese dictatorship came out and said we should have a global currency run by the IMF. And they asked Secretary of the Treasury, Timothy TurboTax Geithner, hey, what do you think about that Chinese proposal for a global currency run by the IMF? And he didn't say, oh, that's crazy, we would never do that. He said, actually, we're quite open to that, right? And the dollar plunged, and everybody said, what? Are you kidding me? But that's the reality. There are forces in China, in Russia, in France. President Sarkozy was talking about this. Vladimir Putin was talking about this openly back in 2008, 2009, 2010 about moving toward a global currency. So there is a very real risk that if they manage to collapse the economy, which I do believe they could do, they could come out and say, well, we'll save you, right? We'll make sure your grocery stores have food in them again. All you have to do is accept this new global currency called an SDR. And they might not say, you and I have to carry it in our wallet, but they may use that to start with, at least, as, a currency to settle international transactions between governments and things like that. And that would be the foot in the door to allow them to do quantitative easing at the global level, to finance their global government through currency expansion. So it could be a disaster. So we have these two different ideas competing, one that would restore an honest monetary system, one that would basically enslave humanity to a corrupt global monetary system. And we got to hope and work and pray that the good one wins out.
Do you know anything about Mark Skidmore and the $21 missing trillion? He's written me a couple of times saying they're giving me documents and they're all just black pages. They're all redacted. You can't make heads or tails out of what happened. Are you worried about that? We have this $20 trillion at the New American Magazine, and then we have this $21 trillion just at the DOD and the Housing Urban Development HUD that they can't find, that's missing. It's out. They $21 trillion. Are you worried about that at the New American Magazine?
Absolutely. In fact, we've written about some of these things. Massive amounts of money have disappeared. Trillions and trillions of dollars. It's very interesting that Donald Rumsfeld, who was the Secretary of Defense at the time, announced that trillions of dollars were missing from the Pentagon. He announced that September 10th, 2001, the day before 9/11. So something that would have been earth-shattering news, right? Trillions of the American people's dollars are missing. We don't know where they went. Suddenly gets eclipsed by the news of September 11th, the terror attack. So something very fishy is going on. This money didn't disappear into thin air, right? Money doesn't just disappear. This money went somewhere. I think we need to find out where that money went. What did they do with it? Are they using it to overthrow foreign governments, arm, terrorist groups? Are they using it to build bunkers and underground tunnels through the mountains? Well, we know some of that's going on, right? So there's all this money that is disappearing from the federal government. Nobody wants to account for it. No one wants to tell us where it goes, but we need to figure that out. And I'm hoping that Trump can put some good, forensic auditors, investigators, accountants on the case here and start tracking some of this down and start putting some of the criminals responsible for disappearing this money into prison where they belong.
Well, what are you going to be working on in the next few weeks at the New American Magazine? What are you coming up without just without giving up too much of your stuff so people don't steal it from you? What do you see coming down the horizon, or down the railroad tracks there for you?
I'm actually turning my attention right now back to Latin America. I grew up in Latin America. I lived, longer than any other place in Mexico. Then I went down to South America for many years. And unfortunately, it hasn't gotten much attention in the media, in the United States at least. But there's a huge story developing down there, and that is the communists, and they are communists, right? I know a lot of people throw that term out there when they're just talking about Bernie Sanders and nutty liberals. But the communists are really playing defense down there now. Nicaragua, massive national uprising to get rid of the Sandinistas. In Brazil, the counter-revolution has almost succeeded, right? The Marxists thought they were totally in power. Now Lula, one of the ringleaders, former President Lula, is sitting in prison for corruption, right? They were looting the state oil company to finance their communist buddies abroad. Dilma Rousseff, his hand-picked successor, former communist terrorist who played a role kidnapping the U.S. ambassador, she's been impeached. And there's a very real prospect now that the communist movement in Brazil will be totally crushed. And this is happening across the region, right? There's a network of Latin American communists called the Foro de Sao Paulo in Portuguese. In English, we would call it the Sao Paulo Forum. The U.S. government knows all about this, right? Although they rarely talk about it. And there was a time during the Obama administration where they thought they were on the verge of seizing the entire hemisphere, right? They had more than 2/3 of the Latin America governments completely under their control, including, some of the anti-communist stalwarts like Chile, right? Which in Chile, Pinochet really dealt a devastating blow to the communist movement there. But even there, Socialist Party candidate Michelle Bachelet, who was part of this Sao Paulo Forum network founded by Castro, the Sandinistas, Lula, and the FARC in Colombia, the Marxist narco-terror group. So they took over all these different countries, and now they're out of power almost everywhere. They are getting crushed. They are getting put in jail. Their sugar daddy, which was the Venezuelan government, right, they were taking all this oil money. They are totally broke. They can't even feed the people. They can't even keep the lights on in Caracas. So this is an incredibly important story. The communists are being routed right in our backyard. Nobody's talking about it. So that's one of the things I'm working on. And then, of course, education is always what I'm working on. We got to save the kids. We got to rescue our American children from there. Right now, they're brainwashing 80 to 90% of our kids in these government schools, and I think that is
the U.S. government. U.S. government.
Exactly. Yep. The U.S. government.
Are we going to turn the tide on the? I mean, I just been calling the Democrats Marxist, communist. I mean, forget this progressive deal. They're Marxist. I mean, you have Keith Ellison is the number 2. You have Perez is number 1. I mean, these guys are into La Raza. They're into the Muslim Brotherhood. They're into the radical Islamic terror. They're into Marxism. I mean, they're into communism. They're not. These are the most radical people you could have leading the Democrat Party, which I think is Marxist and communist. Are they gaining? Are they waning, or are they growing?
Well, in the United States, it's a very interesting question. And you're absolutely right to call these people communists. In fact, I wrote an article, I think, a couple of years ago. The head of the Communist Party USA, John Bachtel, wrote a column in the Communist Party propaganda organ, People's World, right, which, of course, I follow to see what they're up to. And he was bragging about how we utilize the Democratic Party as a vehicle to advance our agenda, right? So first we're going to crush the right using this vehicle, and then we're going to continue and march onward to the communist revolution. So they don't even bother to conceal it anymore. They're openly bragging that the communists have control of the Democratic Party. And if you look at the policies they pursue, actions speak louder than words. These people are if it acts like a communist and quacks like a communist and walks like a communist, it's probably a communist. So they have total control of one of the political parties, but the American people are waking up, right? Even with vote fraud, even with the entire media apparatus on their side, they still cannot win the elections, right? You had, I think, out of 1,000 newspapers, 9 of the top newspapers in the country, 998 endorsed Hillary Clinton, and yet Donald Trump still beat the snot out of them, right? Landslide in the Electoral College. So we now have a situation where the deep state's propaganda machine is not only ineffective, it's almost counterproductive, because the more they tell us we should hate Trump, the more people like Trump. The more they tell us we should want X, the more people oppose X. So it's a very, very interesting dynamic in the United States. I've never seen anything like it in my life. And frankly, I'm hopeful. I'm optimistic. Yeah, we talked earlier, they could try to crash the economy, but there's so much good happening right now that I think there are good reasons for optimism. And I think if we can deal with the education issue, right, I think that's one of the reasons they're so confident. They have 80 to 90% of our kids in these institutions called public schools, where they're being brainwashed with Marxism, with humanism, with, you can be any gender you like, and, all this kind of nonsense. As long as they keep the minds of the youth, Hitler recognized this, Mao recognized, even Abraham Lincoln recognized this, right? The philosophy of the classroom in one generation is going to be the philosophy of government in the next. So I think that's why they're so cocky. But if we can succeed in exposing their government schools and rescuing children from this indoctrination program, I think we have a very real prospect of restoring freedom in this country.
Alex Newman, thenewamerican.com, The New American Magazine. You can find him there. We'll put links up for that. Alex Newman, thanks for joining us today on USAWatchdog.com.
Thank you so much for having me, Greg. Always a pleasure.